It's Game Boy World, and this is a damn good effort. If we've learned anything in 60-odd episodes of Game Boy World, it's that a lot of people were remarkably optimistic about the appeal of portable puzzle games in the early 90s. If we've learned two things, it's that playing a lot of Game Boy imports will create a post-traumatic startled reflex in even the strongest man to send him screaming for a safe place to hide at the mere sight of an anime or tokusatsu property. But if we've learned three things, and I realize this is asking a lot of personal investment in a decades-old obsolete piece of gaming hardware, it's that faithful conversions from NES to Game Boy rarely work. The most successful effort we've seen so far has probably been the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle, which was simple enough and slow enough not to feel egregiously compromised in portable form. Much less palatable, on the other hand, was Ninja Boy, which faithfully translated the visuals and mechanics of Kung Fu Heroes to the tiny screen and ended up being an utterly intolerable piece of filth. Even games that have attempted to rework NES titles with more appropriate portable graphics and gameplay can go horribly awry as often as not. Nintendo's Super Mario Land and Konami's Nemesis turned out quite well, but those same publishers also gave us the abysmal Baseball and Castlevania the Adventure. Compressing colorful, relatively high-resolution games into Game Boy's tiny monochromatic format was a gamble for game makers back in the day, a total crapshoot that often resulted in, well, crap. Which brings us to Burai Fighter Deluxe, a shooter that comes to us courtesy of developer Kid and publisher Taxan, and is far and away the most direct NES to Game Boy adaptation we've seen since, wow, I don't know, baseball maybe? Tetris at the very least. Burai Fighter Deluxe, as the name suggests, adapts the NES game Burai Fighter. I question the use of the term deluxe, given that this port involves a lot of compromises and cuts out several stages, but okay, deluxe it is. At the very least, you have to hand it to Kid and Taxan. This is one heck of an ambitious choice for a portable adaptation. Burai Fighter on NES was a fast-paced and quite impressive shoot-'em-up, boasting great graphics and an upgrade system that could potentially fill the screen with projectiles. Deluxe does its best to recreate the NES game, duplicating the graphics, the enemies, and the play mechanics. Not only that, but it seems to have been developed in tandem with the NES game. Deluxe first appeared in Japan in June 1990. In fact, Deluxe actually appeared on Game Boy in Japan a full month before the Famicom version, which honestly was probably the correct order in which to experience the game. Technically accomplished as Deluxe may be for the platform, it's far and away less enjoyable than the console rendition. Like many games of the 8-bit era, Burai Fighter sat squarely in the horizontally scrolling shooter category. Although technically sometimes it scrolled vertically, so let's call it a side-scrolling shooter. Unlike, say, Gradius or R-Type, Burai Fighter allowed players to fire freely in 8 different directions. It's pretty ambitious for a 1990 vintage game, and tricky too, since the NES wasn't precisely set up for twin-stick shooting. Since you couldn't exactly move and fire independently on NES, or Game Boy, Burai Fighter offered a compromise wherein you could move in a different direction from your weapon blasts by moving in one direction to take aim and locking your fire. By holding down the fire button, you could maintain a steady aim in that direction while moving freely around the screen. For much of the game, this amounts to something very similar to a standard horizontal shooter, in which you're firing constantly forward while moving around to evade foes. But you have the freedom to switch up your aim and fire in different directions as needed, which becomes incredibly helpful when the scrolling direction changes up. Burai Fighter doesn't really have any precedent on Game Boy, but NES fans would probably recognize it as a roided-up take on Capcom's classic shooter Section Z. In this case, though, you can fire in more than just 2 directions. Also, rather than featuring branching level paths like Section Z on NES, it harkens more to the original arcade version, in which the scrolling would alternate between horizontal and vertical every few stages. Burai Fighter plays much better than Section Z, especially the arcade version, and the multi-directional aiming has a lot to do with that. Now, on NES, Burai Fighter moved at a rapid, unforgiving clip, with speedy enemies and tons of projectiles. On Game Boy, Burai Fighter moves more sluggishly, confronts you with fewer foes, and generally is much kinder than its console counterpart. This is a matter of necessity. With Burai Fighter Deluxe, the developers modified the graphics from the NES proportions, but not quite enough. The player character's Game Boy sprite has been reduced to 3/4 of his NES pixel height, but that's still not quite enough to fit things correctly into the Game Boy screen, whose height is 2/3 that of the NES. In order to squeeze all the NES stages into these mismatched proportions, you can push the edges of the screen a little way in each direction to reveal more visual information. While this seems like a good idea in concept, in practice it's fairly awful. The screen doesn't scroll to reveal extra info until you push up close to its edge, which, in a game where enemies can appear from any direction at any time, poses obvious disadvantages. Of course, the idea with old shooters like this is to memorize everything with a vengeance, at which point you'll know when and where you can shoot, and when you can scroll the screen. But even beyond memorization, the crowded visuals crimp the action. Because players have less space in which to react and respond to threats, the developers had to strip out a great many of those threats. You face fewer enemy formations, and they often contain fewer opponents. They move more slowly, fire less often, and shoot more leisurely projectiles. Like the NES game, Deluxe offers 3 difficulty levels, but generally speaking, the Game Boy's difficulty levels feel like a step below the equivalent levels in the original game. This erodes part of Burai Fighter's core appeal, and it means the game is much easier to complete. Not every compromise Deluxe makes is a bad one, though. It also loses the NES game's odd top-down stages in which you flew around shooting infinitely spawning enemies in a featureless void as you searched for the stage boss. The top-down levels were remarkably similar to the exploratory stages from Cosmo Tank, and I feel we've had quite enough of that. So the loss doesn't exactly sting. It makes Burai Fighter Deluxe a shorter game, yes, but a more consistent and focused one. Anyway, the most important parts of Burai Fighter, its central play mechanics, have come across in fine style. The game may move at a slower pace, and the screen dimensions may feel more cramped, but Deluxe still feels like Burai Fighter. The 8-way fire and lock system remains intact, although changing directions does feel somewhat sticky at times due to the more sluggish pace of the game. Your gunner moves more slowly than on NES, and he seems to respond to commands more slowly as well. Just as essentially, the NES game's unique power-up system remains intact as well. Burai Fighter has an interesting power-up mechanism, reminiscent of Hudson's PC Engine Star Soldier games, but nevertheless possessing its own distinct character. Your fighter has innate access to 3 different weapons, each of which is unlocked by collecting the proper icon: lasers, rings, and missiles. You can't cycle to a different weapon on your own steam, but instead switch to the weapon whose icon you've most recently collected. Your power-ups work with a progressive system, meaning that each new icon you collect adds to the power of the corresponding weapon. Each weapon can be powered up individually through a whopping 10 steps, and while the 3 upgrades initially seem completely indistinct from one another, the more you juice them up, the more they stand apart from one another. Initially, each weapon simply improves on your forward firepower, but after a few upgrades, you automatically fire forward and backward. Once you max out a weapon's firepower, it becomes extraordinarily powerful in its own distinct way. The laser fires in 4 directions diagonal to your aimed fire, while the maxed missile fires in all 4 cardinal directions relative to the angle you're facing. The ring, however, is the boss tier choice. It fires a wide triple spread forward and a single shot behind. As any student of Contra knows, spread guns are basically how you win everything, and Burai Fighter is no different. There's a catch though: when you die, you lose all your upgrades for your current weapon. You do not, however, lose the upgrades for your 2 inactive weapons. So it behooves you to alternate your weapons and not lean too heavily on your favorite, building all of them up equally. That way, when you die, you don't lose everything. This creates a subtle but effective strategic element to the game, forcing you to weigh the advantages of sticking to a single supercharged weapon versus cycling through them and upgrading each in parallel. There's a second strategy at play too, concerning your alternate weapon. As you gun through each stage, you'll pick up smaller icons that fill up an E-meter at the bottom left. At any point, you can drain the E-meter in exchange for a screen-clearing super attack. But if you don't burn the E-power and manage to fill the meter to max, you'll instead automatically spend it for a 1-up. There's kind of a roguelike trade-off at play here. Is it better to hoard your E-meter and hope you live long enough to max out the meter for an extra life, which usually takes about a full level to accomplish? Or do you use that energy for a desperation attack, losing out on the prospect of an extra life, but perhaps ensuring that your current life doesn't end prematurely? The innate quality of the underlying game more or less makes up for the shortcomings of the Game Boy port. Back in 1990, I could see this making for a fairly satisfying handheld game, even if the final stage is a series of cheap, forced memorization traps and gimmicks. In the here and now, however, Burai Fighter Deluxe is made essentially obsolete not by the NES game, but by Deluxe's secret Game Boy Color remake. You wouldn't know it's a remake by its title, Space Marauder, but this 2000 release was called Burai Fighter Color in Japan, and it's 100% a colorized port of Deluxe. Space Marauder does more than just add some color to the game, though that helps a great deal in telling enemy projectiles apart from power-ups. No, it's a much faster, smoother rendition of the game. Interestingly, Space Marauder is very definitely an adaptation of Burai Fighter Deluxe, not of the NES game. Although Game Boy Color saw many straight adaptations of NES software, kids stuck with the portable version. Wisely, as Deluxe may have been compromised somewhat to work on Game Boy, but it did work. A direct conversion of the NES game would have played disastrously, even if it would have looked prettier. All in all, Burai Fighter Deluxe is one of the better NES conversions we've seen on Game Boy, despite its flaws, and despite its being made obsolete a decade later. I suppose this level of quality should be expected coming from Kid and Taxan, one of my favorite B-tier NES-era pairings. In Taxan's short life as the Nilbog offshoot of Naxat, their collaborations with Kid also gave us the weird but well-meaning Low G-Man, and the surprisingly excellent G.I. Joe for NES. The connection between the two companies also makes this the first proper East-West collaboration for Game Boy, unless the enigmatic Wizards & Warriors X was secretly designed for Rare by Tosei. Because you see, speaking of Rare, Burai Fighter was designed as a joint venture by the Japanese studio Kid and Taxan USA product manager and future Microsoft and Rare producer Ken Lobb. Similar to how Sunsoft handled some of its latter-day NES projects like Fester's Quest, Lobb drafted plans for Burai Fighter in the US, which Kid then designed to spec. Lobb even signed the game. The ending includes either a taunt or a word of praise credited to him, depending on the difficulty level. And hey, if someone were to take personal credit for a Game Boy game, this is a pretty decent one to go with. While Burai Fighter Deluxe is the worst of the 3 versions of the same game, that game is good enough that the quality shines through regardless. This may not be an all-time classic, but it sure stands above the average Game Boy Drek. For more NES conversions of variable ambition and quality, keep watching Game Boy World. Next time, same genre, very different quality.